back at the road, but the car was out of control. In a split second, the vehicle veered off course and crashed into a lamppost, the impact throwing them all forward. David remained unconscious, his injuries severe, but still alive. The three boys, David, Chris, and Marcus, lived in a small, bustling neighborhood. They were childhood friends who had stuck together through thick and thin. But as they grew older, the differences between them became more apparent. David was the quiet, introspective one, always looking for ways to improve his life, but often unsure how. Chris was the boldest of the three, quick to act and speak, confident in his ability to manipulate any situation. Marcus, the dreamer, was somewhere in between, a mix of caution and ambition. It was December 31st, and the biggest party of the year was just hours away. People from all over the city would gather, each trying to outdo the other with lavish outfits, expensive gifts, and extravagant gestures. For David, Chris, and Marcus, it was more than just a party. It was a chance to make an impression, to be seen by the right people, to gain respect, to make their mark in the world. But there was one problem. None of them had money. They had been scraping by with odd jobs and minor hustles, but nothing that could afford them the lifestyle they dreamed of. David, always the idealist, had a clear vision in his mind. He imagined himself walking into the party with his friends, heads turning as they admired their success. But without money, how could they possibly get in? The boys gathered at their usual hangout spot, an abandoned garage on the outskirts of the neighborhood. The walls were covered in graffiti, and the faint smell of old oil lingered in the air. They sat around a small table with a few beers and a plate of chips, the weight of their situation hanging over them. "We can't just walk into that party looking like this," Chris said, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. "We need to make a statement, a real one." David nodded, his mind racing for ideas. "We could sell some of the stuff we have, the old electronics, but that won't be enough. We need a lot more." Chris grinned, his eyes narrowing with the familiar glint of mischief. "What if we get it another way? We could—" David cut him off before he could finish. "Not that way, Chris. We've been over this. We don't want to get mixed up in that." But Chris wasn't listening. He was already on a roll, his words coming faster now. "We're talking fast money here. You know as well as I do that waiting around for change isn't going to work. We do something tonight, something big. We can break into a place. Wealthy people are always out this time of year, and no one will notice. We could grab everything we need." Marcus, ever the cautious one, was reluctant. "You're talking about robbery, Chris. That's dangerous. If we get caught—" Chris waved him off. "We'll be in and out before anyone notices. It'll be easy." The room fell silent for a moment as David and Marcus exchanged nervous glances. David was the first to speak. "Chris, maybe you're right, but we need to be smart about it. This can't just be some reckless thing. We have to plan. Or we could talk to the juju man," Marcus interjected nervously. "He's always got money flowing, you know. We can ask him for a charm or something." Chris rolled his eyes. "Juju? Really, Marcus? That's not going to help us. We need action, not magic." David, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke. "You know what? I say we do it. The robbery. But only if we plan it right. And we do it together. No backing out." After a long pause, Marcus sighed. "I don't like it, but if you guys are going, I'll go. But we need to be careful. We can't get caught." The decision was made. The boys agreed to go through with it. Over the next few hours, the boys meticulously planned the robbery. They didn't know much about the house they were targeting, but they knew it was large, owned by a wealthy couple who often hosted lavish parties. They also knew the couple would be out that night, attending the same party the boys had hoped to crash. They figured this would give them a 2-hour window to get in, take what they could, and get out. They decided on their roles. Chris would drive, Marcus would stay in the car as a lookout, and David would go inside with Chris, grabbing whatever valuables they could carry. They would meet back at the car in 45 minutes, plenty of time to avoid suspicion. As the clock ticked down toward midnight, they prepared. They all wore dark clothes, their faces obscured by scarves. Their hearts raced with excitement, mixed with a rising sense of dread. This wasn't just a small crime. It was a step into a darker world, one that would change them forever. The streets were quiet as they approached the mansion. The lights were off inside and the driveway was empty except for a few parked cars. Chris parked the car at the end of the block, out of sight, and the three of them crept toward the house. David and Chris slipped through the back gate, while Marcus stayed behind, keeping watch. As they entered the house, they were immediately struck by how opulent everything looked. The furniture, the paintings, the jewelry, everything screamed wealth. "This is it," Chris whispered, his eyes gleaming. "Let's make it quick." David nodded, his stomach in knots. They had planned everything, but now that they were inside, reality hit. He felt the weight of what they were about to do. They started gathering items, cash, electronics, jewelry. But as they were rummaging through drawers, they heard a door creak open. A voice rang out. "Who's there?" Before David could react, a man appeared in the hallway, holding a large wooden stick. "Get out!" he shouted. Chaos erupted. David and Chris scrambled to escape, but the man swung the stick, hitting David square in the head. He crumpled to the floor, dazed and unconscious. Chris froze for a second, but then grabbed the nearest valuables and bolted out of the house. "Marcus, we need to go!" he yelled as he ran to the car. Marcus, still watching from the car, saw them emerge from the house. He started the engine, ready to speed off. But as they got in, a siren blared in the distance. The police were closing in, having been alerted by the alarm. "Go! Go!" Chris shouted, his heart pounding in his chest. The car sped down the street, but Chris was panicking. His hands shook as he gripped the wheel, and his foot pressed too hard on the accelerator. The car swerved, barely missing other vehicles as the sirens grew louder. David, still bleeding and unconscious, was a mess in the back seat. Marcus looked at him, then back at the road, but the car was out of control. In a split second, the vehicle veered off course and crashed into a lamppost, the impact throwing them all forward. David remained unconscious, his injuries severe, but still alive. Chris, knocked out by the crash, didn't stir. Marcus, disoriented but alive, managed to crawl out of the wreckage, gasping for breath. He knew they had to leave, but where would he go? The sirens were closing in. In a daze, Marcus stumbled toward the nearby bridge. Desperate for a way out, he leapt into the river below, the cold water hitting him like a shock to the system. He swam, but his strength began to wane. Meanwhile, the police found Chris and David, both unconscious but alive. Marcus, now in the river, was caught by a nearby security camera, the footage playing across news stations within hours. Marcus was arrested days later after being pulled from the river. The story spread quickly. 3 boys, once full of dreams of impressing others, now broken by their choices. They had paid the ultimate price for their desperation. The boys were now facing a future far different from the one they had imagined. David woke up in the hospital, his head bandaged and his body sore from the crash. He knew he had lost much more than just the opportunity to attend a party. Marcus sat in a cold cell, haunted by the choices he'd made. The taste of freedom he'd sought by jumping into the water felt hollow now. Chris, too, sat in a holding cell, thinking of how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. Their dreams of wealth, fame, and respect had been shattered in an instant. The party they'd hoped to crash would be forever out of their reach. They had learned the hard way that some things once lost could never be regained.